Okay, so this is our Simondon reading group. We're continuing our reading of Imagination and Invention. If my notes from last time are correct, I think we're starting at page 38 of the translation. So last time we started on part one of the book, the actual sort of body of the book after the introduction, and so we're looking at the relationship between motricity and the image is sort of the general theme of what we've been reading so far. So, what is the connection between images as a part of mental life and motor action? And he's starting with non-human animals as sort of like a reference point for a lot of what he's talking about here. But he does bring up human behavior as well. So the idea here is that we can use non-human animals as a sort of reference points to sometimes see things in a simpler setting, like a behavioral repertoire that has sort of less complication than human behavior in certain animals. So that helps to sort of bring out phenomena that we might not notice, or it might be harder to pin down in human beings. And then we also have then sort of the other direction is that sometimes we can understand animal behavior better by comparing it with a related human behavior. He talks about like the example of human children that play with dolls as a kind of the doll has to have a sort of motor a relation to the motor behavior of pretending to raise a child, of carrying and cradling and so on, as opposed to a sort of perceptual resemblance to a child. So he talks about how like a bundle of rags that has sort of a vaguely arm, body, leg sort of shape is probably better as a toy, as a doll for a child than like an anatomically accurate model of a human baby, but one that's like fragile or rigid or something that doesn't actually have the same kind of relationship to the human behavior of carrying a child. And I brought up last time the concept of affordances, which Simondon doesn't use here. I'm not sure if he was aware of James Gibson's work or not, but it was around the same time in the 1960s that he was developing these concepts. And so this idea of an affordance has to do with the relationship between an organism and some feature of the environment, and what sort of actions that feature of the environment allows the organism to perform. So a surface is walkable, for example, for a certain organism, whereas for another organism it might not be walkable. Like one of the sort of classic examples that's used is that for certain insects, the surface of a pond might be walkable, whereas for say I don't know, a dog or a human, the surface of the pond is not walkable. And so this affordance of walkability is something that is sort of a relationship between the behavior of an organism, the sort of actions that organism can perform, and features of the environment. And so different organisms will have sort of bring out or be able to recognize different affordances in the physical environment. And so Simondon was talking about a similar idea here about how different objects or different aspects of the environment are related to different elements of the behavioral repertoire of different organisms. And so obviously we're primarily interested in humans, but he's using other organisms to sort of bring out this relativity of the aspects of the environment to motor behavior. So that's what we looked at last time. So let's pick up from, I think we're at the subsection break, subsection 5, motor images and imitation. So maybe someone else could read from there the full subsection, I think.
I can read this section. Sorry, we're on subsection 5?
Yeah, I think that's where we stopped.
I think that sounds right. Yeah. Okay. Subsection 5, motor images and imitation, phenomena of sympathetic induction. So-called quote-unquote imitation phenomena would seem to suggest that the perception of a movement is necessary in order for another individual of the same species to reproduce it. There would then be a kind of learning that presupposed neither spontaneity nor the preexistence of a motor image in the subject that reproduced a movement or a characteristic posture. In fact, notions such as quote-unquote monkeying that presume the possibility of a servile imitation of perceived movements among animals are devoid of serious foundation. Certain functional imitations exist among birds, words of human language, musical tunes, perfecting of specific song. But such facts are rare and belong rather to the general category of perfecting innate schemas than to pure imitation. It was not possible to teach monkeys to write by guiding their hands for many hours. They are also unable to learn the use of a device such as the lock on a box by observing another member of their species that knows how to use it. Phenomena taken to be instances of imitation are generally cases of sympathetic induction. Katz and Revesz discovered this phenomenon in studying chickens that were fed in isolation until they refused food. Placed among fasting chickens and the same kind of food, the former, however satiated, started eating again as soon as the latter began. The motions and sounds of pecking exerted a sympathetic induction equivalent to the reemergence of the motivation that had vanished. It is not a case of imitation because pecking is entirely innate in chickens. As soon as it leaves the egg, the chick knows how to peck. Sympathetic induction implies the preexistence of a motor image functioning as a motivation. Such induction effects occur among humans, particularly for the most instinctual activities. Detecting the various types of sympathetic induction might serve as a way to investigate instinctual behaviors. This effect is observable in eating and behaviors such as gathering, fleeing, entering a hall, getting up from a chair, and leaving a room. It is even more notable in pairing rites, so-called erotic films, and in exhibitions of violence, the so-called quote-unquote crowd phenomena Le Bon studied, used in the propaganda of totalitarian regimes. All modes of reproduction and transmission of temporal sequences may evince sympathetic induction. TV, films, but also speeches, music, and singing, Hitler's speeches, revolutionary singing, military marches. The quote-unquote force of the example is exerted through the effects of sympathetic induction. It intervenes essentially in domains where instinctual conducts exist, that is, in primary categories of behavior. So this section, if I'm reading it correctly, seems to be sort of clearing away a potential objection, which is that these imitation phenomena seem to depend on perception first, which would seem to be a problem for Simondon's argument that these motor functions are a priori, but he argues that they aren't, it's not the perception that is first, but that perception can sort of trigger a pre-existing motor schema.
Yeah, I think that's right. So he wants to distinguish between imitation in the proper sense of the term, which, as you pointed out, depends on perception. So you perceive a certain kind of behavior, and then you imitate that behavior and perform it for yourself. That's what he wants to distinguish from the other case, which is the one that he's interested in here, where perception at some level serves to sort of trigger or release a kind of behavior that is not copied from some other observation. So like in the case of the chickens, chickens don't learn how to peck at food by watching other chickens. They know how to do that from birth, or from hatching, I should say. They already know how to do it, but observing other chickens pecking at food sort of elicits this behavior of pecking, even when the chickens have already just eaten as much as they want. So he wants to distinguish these two kinds of cases, and he's arguing, or he's suggesting here that the case of the eliciting of behavior is more fundamental than the one of imitation. He thinks that imitation, in the sort of strict sense of the term, is a relatively rare phenomenon in the animal world. He talks about, like, in the case of birds that learn to say human words, for example, or they learn songs or things like that. I think maybe more recent animal psychology or ethology would put more emphasis on the imitation side. That there are more animals that we know now than in the 1960s that learn through something like imitation. Like they have a cultural transmission of like birdsong. Simon don't mentions this sort of in passing, but many songbirds have sort of local dialects of their song. So each there's sort of a common structure that all birds of that species use, but then there are sort of variations of that same common structure in different localities. So each bird that's learning how to sing the particular song of its species has to learn the specific variety that is used in that locality, and so it has to sort of fill in the details of the song based on imitation learning. And this is also the case with whales. They have different sort of dialects of the whale song, and I think some other animals as well. But yeah, so it's more widespread than Simondo maybe is recognizing here. But I think the point of trying to distinguish between something that involves learning in the proper sense of the term and imitation in the narrow sense, and then something that a kind of motor schema that requires a recognition of a certain phenomenon in the environment to be elicited. Yeah, so I think distinguishing those two sort of aspects of behavior, even if they might be more intricately interconnected than maybe he's letting on here, I think that distinction is still valid. Yes, and then that bit about the monkeys is interesting because yeah, so there have been some experiments, not with monkeys, but with chimpanzees and gorillas to try to teach them human language. So one of the sort of basic obstacles is the vocal articulatory mechanisms are different in humans and other apes. So the humans have our larynx is lower in our throat, and that allows our tongue to move more freely. Whereas other apes have a much higher larynx, and so their tongue can't move as freely as ours can. So what some researchers decided to do was to try to teach sign language to chimpanzees and gorillas because their hands are just as free as ours are. They can perform all sorts of intricate movements with their hands. And what the sort of, I mean, this is not something that I know very well, but the sort of I think consensus position is that in these experiments so these apes were able to learn sometimes a few hundred signs for different objects, for example, or different actions. But in general, they didn't learn the sort of syntactic structure of language in the way that human sign language users do. So they learn sort of isolated words, and they can sort of string them together, and then respond to strings of words, but they don't learn like the syntactic structure in the same way that humans do. And there's actually an interesting case of one. This is sort of an aside, but there's one case where a chimpanzee, a mother chimpanzee, was being taught to use these signs, and the infant that she was sort of carrying around, or who was like in the room during these experiments, actually learned just sort of by observation, as opposed to sort of explicit teaching. Learned all the signs that his mother did, but actually learned much more sort of grammatical structure, and so was able to learn how to respond to new sentences, like put the apple in the corner or whatever, something like that, like new instructions that had never been presented before, and so this I think it's Kenzo, I think is this chimp's name, if I remember correctly, was able to learn how to sort of take known words and put them together into novel sentences and understand the structure of those sentences and perform appropriate actions in response. So again, there's more sort of complicated learning in animals than maybe Simondon recognized at the time, just based on the what was available in scientific literature at that time. But I think the sort of basic point, the basic distinction between these two kinds of responses of behavior to the environment is still a valid one.
Oh, I'm just wondering. If it is too much generalization of animals, like human beings, like for example, chickens, like in the experimental presented in the text, like those chickens could do that way, but the other kinds of chickens, could do the individual different kind of singular behavior. Show singular behavior different from like the behavior like the chickens are in the text. So what I want to say is that in terms of animal world, like there is a kind of a limitation human being could observe, or so what Simondon tried to bring up like could be like some kind of a too much generalization of like the animal world.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think in animal psychology or ethology, the tendency is always to try to find species specific behaviors or species characteristic behaviors. So like pigeons will do X in situation Y, or pigs will do Z in situation W, or whatever. But it's true that yes, individual animals have their own sort of life history and capacities, and I think it's fair to say even a personality in terms of like some animals might be more interested in the experiment and might try to figure out what exactly they're supposed to do. Others might think this is stupid and like why is this experimenter keep showing me the same picture over and over again, or something like that. So the animals have their own dispositions to respond in various ways that might be specific to an individual animal as opposed to characteristic of the species. But in general, the sort of experimental situation of taking multiple animals and then maybe like averaging out their response and saying the average response time of the rat to this stimulus was 10 milliseconds or whatever. So that's like the type of result that you tend to get in studies of animal behavior is an average or a generalization, but that sort of hides the individual variation of what the different animal dispositions might be to respond in different ways, and that's something that I think would be much more difficult to study than like trying to get averages. So yeah, it's probably something that hasn't really been studied a lot as far as I know. Like just specific behaviors of individual animals as a field of study is something that I don't think has been examined that much.
I think the end of this paragraph, at the end of this section, when he then applies the example of animal behavior to human behavior, I think seems significant. So he talks about these induction effects, so whereby the chicken which you imagine doesn't want any more food is induced to start eating by the example of other chickens. So he's looking at he's saying that basically it's a good way of investigating instinctual activities, so the kind of unthought instinctive activities, and detecting the various types of sympathetic induction might serve as a way to investigate instinctual behaviors. Yeah, and so then he gives these examples of eating and fleeing, entering a hall, etc., etc. But then he goes on to, at the end, he talks about modes of reproduction and transmission of temporal. So basically, I think he's talking about films and TV, so how these are then captured and then repeated, I think, what he's saying. And he gives the example of Hitler's speeches. It seems to me that one of the big problems is the lack of speech, the lack of language between animals and humans, because I would have thought Hitler's speeches were mostly fantastic examples of rhetoric. I don't mean fantastic in a good way, by the way, but they're examples of speech, the force of language to induce behavior. So I'm not quite sure where we've got the notion of films. So we might see a film of a behavior, certain behavior, which then the idea is somehow it induces certain behavior, certain instinctual behavior on our part. And yet what's missing from that is the kind of role of language in that, I would say.
Yeah, that's a good point. We mentioned this at one point when we were talking about the individuation book, how Simondon has pretty much nothing to say about language in general, which is kind of surprising given how sort of broad-ranging his interests are. And that's kind of one of the key distinctions between these sort of animal examples that he talks about of induction of behavior, and then human examples is again that mediating role of language. So some of the examples, like the Hitler speeches example, they obviously depend on linguistic mediation or linguistic sort of representation of some kind. But I think maybe what he's thinking of in that context is not so much the content of the speech, so the linguistic linguistic content of the speech, but the sort of it's not something I've sort of studied in detail, but like if you see clips from Hitler's speeches, he's sort of gesticulating and yelling and sort of there's like a sort of motor capacity or motor aspect of the speeches that the gestures and the intonation and things like that are things that maybe that's what he's thinking of, that other people in the crowd are sort of responding to these aspects of the speech at least as much, if not more, than to the sort of representational content, the linguistic content of the speech. But yeah, that example is definitely more difficult than some of the other ones. And I think he talks about later on, or maybe it's a different text, but he talks about maybe some better examples of this type of induction in humans are things like laughter and yawning, which are universal human behaviors. Like every culture, humans in every culture have these behaviors. And then they're also like we talk about laughter and yawning as being contagious. Like you see someone laughing, you start laughing, even if you don't really know what the joke is or what they're laughing about. And this is like, old sitcoms where they put a laugh track on something it like makes it even if you know what's going on, it still makes it seem as if something is funny just because other people are laughing at it, even if the joke is not actually any good. Seeing another person yawn makes us, have the urge to yawn. So these types of behaviors are not behaviors we have to learn by watching other people. We don't have to learn how to laugh, for example. But they're sort of induced by seeing other people perform those behaviors. So those are maybe better examples of this type of induced behavior in humans. And then some of the examples that he gives are more complicated precisely because of that role of language that you brought up. So there's some sort of interaction between the sort of induced behavior side and the linguistic representation that, they interact with each other in some way, but it's more complicated than just, seeing someone laughing and then feeling the urge to laugh yourself.
Yeah, because I think the one of the primary ideas. So what I'm talking about really, I suppose, is rhetoric. So one of the primary ideas behind rhetoric is that it will enable movement. So it does. We're talking here about movement. So the movement in one will induce a movement in another, and that, in a sense, is one of the foundations of rhetorical speech. But what it does, it moves you. It does move you to action. Actually, I mean, that's one of the principles of political rhetoric. That it makes you do something. So the person speaking, the rhetor, what they're trying to do is to induce movement in the people who are listening. But that movement may not be it might not be movement of bodily movement. It's more likely to be kind of movement of sentiment, movement of emotion, movement of mind. And I think that's probably the big difference, I would imagine, between the kind of motor induction that Simondon is focusing on here, which is a kind of an outward show of movement, bodily movement, with an inward show of feelings. And I think that's a big difference, I would say.
Yeah, that's an interesting point too, because we talk about like something being a moving speech or a moving, poem or something like that. Like we use this metaphor of, and even the word emotion has the root of motion in it. So it's a sort of there's a sort of metaphorical and etymological connection between our conception of emotional or affective responses to situations like a speech, and then the actual emotion that the speech might elicit from us. So yeah, I think Simondon maybe is going a little bit quickly here with this, with his sort of examples that he brings up about political speeches and so on. There's probably different sort of levels of interaction at work in our response to a speech or a political song or something like that. So we're sort of, there's the maybe most basic level is the behavioral induction that this situation elicits a behavior in us that we sort of perform, or that we have this disposition to perform without learning. And then there might be a level of imitation in the proper sense of the term that he's distinguishing here. So learned behaviors that we've learned from observing other people. And then there's like maybe an intellectual level where we grasp the content of what the person is saying in the speech, and we either agree with it or disagree with it, or think it's smart or stupid or whatever. And so all these things sort of interact with each other to bring about a response in the person. And when rhetoric is effective, it's when all of those things all sort of push in the same direction. So you find yourself agreeing with the content of the speech, and you also feel inclined towards action, and you feel positive sentiment towards the speaker and things like that. So all these things sort of interact with each other to bring about a response in the audience. But yeah, I think it's probably more complicated than Simondon was letting on in this section. Yeah, and that's an interesting point that Angus has brought up in the chat here about the use of charms and spells in and what connection it has to poetry. So yeah, like magic speech in various societies has sort of one of the common features in many cases is that you have these sort of rhythmic repetitions, or so things like rhymes or restricted metrical structures and things like that sort of mark off the speech of the magic spell or the charm or whatever. They make it distinct from everyday speech, and this the sort of repetitive structure or rhythmical structure helps to sort of reinforce the difference between everyday speech, and also to make it easier to memorize these texts or these speeches. And so yeah, there's all kinds of and so yeah, the sort of rhythmical structure, the just the sound structure of this sort of form of speech can produce effects in us in terms of making us feel like we can grasp we can memorize the speech more easily, and things like that. So yeah, there's all kinds of sort of complicated phenomena here that Simondon is not really. He just sort of points towards some of these phenomena, but doesn't really investigate. So yeah, bringing in language and how language has these different levels in it, I think would be interesting. Yes, the oral tradition of some of the epic poems. I think we brought this up when we were talking about individuation. Like the Iliad and the Odyssey were likely first transmitted as oral poems, given their structure, the epithets that are used for swift-footed Achilles and things like that. These are characteristic of orally transmitted poems, and so there's a good chance that the poems that we associate with Homer as the author were part of an oral tradition, whoever it was who actually sat down and wrote the forms that we have now. And yeah, so the sort of rhythmic structure of the poem and some of these sort of fixed phrases helped to make it more easily memorizable. Okay, so let's go on to subsection 6. Yeah, let's read the whole thing. If someone else could, actually no, let's just do one page. It's like kind of an awkward length, but yeah. So if someone else could read the next page or so of subsection 6, if I can get a volunteer.
Yeah, I'll do it.
Here, I can read. Oh, go ahead, Derek.
It's okay. You go.
Okay. Inherence of motor images in the body schema. We call body schema the representation that each of us makes of their own body and serves as a reference in space. This schematic representation, which is constant and necessary for normal life, may undergo alterations as a result either of brain lesions, parietal lobe, amputations, or various motor incapacities. The corporeal schema likely integrates sensorial data of various kinds, exteroceptive and proprioceptive, but motor anticipations play a considerable part in the organization of the body schema. Taking up the notion of an action system developed above, we might say that the body schema contains the intuition of the action system of each individual. It corresponds to the fact that an individual immediately knows how to use his set of organs, not only when the whole body is intact, but also following an amputation. In The Organism, Goldstein gives particular importance to the recovery of functions through a reorganization of the whole following a lesion. Goldstein cites an experiment in which all 4 limbs of anesthetized guinea pigs are amputated. When the anesthesia wanes, these badly mutilated animals do not try to walk on their stumps. Instead, they immediately adopt a mode of writhing comparable to that of limbless animals. Motricity is reorganized as a whole on the basis of the remaining functional possibilities of the whole organism. It effectuates a complete restructuring. Of course, such an interpretation conforms with Goldstein's holism, developed into a general theory of the organism and its function, according to the doctrine which generalizes the figure-ground relation posited by Gestalt psychology. But in this particular case, the organism does indeed translate the correspondence between motor intuition, a semi-concrete image of the body's possibilities, and the organization of the body. The primordial basis for the various motor images is the intuition of possible movements in their organization and succession. The modality of motor images is the possible, because they devolve from an action system that is initially experienced as the organized network of the movements of the body proper, du corps propre.
Yeah, we can stop here. So he brings up here this notion of the body schema. There's a footnote or an endnote in the English text that I didn't actually check, but yeah. So this is this notion of a body schema is so the idea here is that an organism, whether human or other animal, has a sort of self-depiction or a self-representation of its own body. And this body schema, as Simondo points out here, it evolved over time. So, of course, as an infant, you have a certain representation of your body as being a certain size, and you have certain capacities for grasping objects or walking and so on. And then as you get older, you grow, your representation of yourself in relation to the rest of the world changes, and your capacities for action change as well. And he points out here that in the case, so this is something that Goldstein studied a lot. He worked in particular with World War I veterans who had suffered amputations or brain damage. And the body schema of these people also changes, so sometimes not adequately. So sometimes people, so there's the famous phenomenon of phantom limbs. So people that lose a hand or an arm or a leg or whatever, sometimes still have sensation in that missing body part. They feel like an itch in their hand that's missing. And of course, you can't scratch your missing hand, so it's very a very frustrating sensation. But in general, so these are sort of exceptional cases and usually only last for a few months or a certain amount of time before eventually the body schema adapts to the missing hand. So you no longer try to grasp things with your hand that is not there. You use your hand that you still have to you adapt your behavior to grasp an object with one hand instead of with two hands, like you might have done before the amputation. The body schema adapts over time to the changes in the body, whether part of just growth and maturation or the result of amputation or something like that. And so Simondon brings up the Goldstein's argument about how this adaptation has a kind of holistic character. So this is one of the sort of central ideas of Goldstein, is this holistic nature of the organism. So the organism responds not just so it's when when a certain when an amputation happens or when there's a brain damage, the response of the organism is not just to sort of subtract the function of that organ that is missing or that piece of the brain that's missing. The response of the organism involves a reorganization of the sort of total structure of the behavior of the organism to sort of compensate for what is missing. So like the sort of example that I was giving before is that if you lose a hand, you no longer use that arm to reach for things. Once you sort of adapt to losing a hand, you change your behavior so that you use the remaining arm to grasp things. So that's sort of a very basic example of restructuring your behavior. But even in the case of people that have a stroke, for example, that causes brain damage, they might lose the ability to speak for a certain amount of time and then regain at least partial ability to speak later on. The stroke damages regions of the brain that are necessary for speech. But then after maybe a few months or a year or a couple years, the person is able to sort of restructure their speech system in their brain and regain some of the lost capacity of speech. So this is what Goldstein takes to be sort of a holistic response of the organism to the environment and to changes in the body schema. Simondon brings this up here he wants to relate the motor images to the body schemas. That's what we'll see when we continue reading. So the motor images are always connected to the body schema, to the capacity for action that we sort of experience ourselves as having. We always experience ourselves as having the capacity to perform certain actions based on how our body is set up, and this experience of being able to perform certain actions is one end of the relation that brings up the motor image at the other end. So you experience, to bring up the concept of affordances, you experience an object as graspable if you have a hand that can grasp it. Whereas if the object is too big or too small or I don't know, too sharp or whatever, you don't experience the object as graspable anymore. Or if you don't have hands, for example, you might not experience the object as graspable. And so this type of sort of adaptation, or this relationship between the organism and the motor image, is one that is mediated by the body schema, the sort of representation of ourselves that we have and our experience of ourselves as capable of performing certain actions.
I was recently reading some of that Peter Godfrey Smith book, Other Minds, and part of his theory of the origin of the self is these, I think they're called reafference mechanisms, even in relatively simple nervous systems, which enable an animal to distinguish between actions that it has caused and actions caused by the environment. He talks about how, a very simple organism will react to exogenous actions by withdrawing. But, if there was no way to distinguish between an endogenous action and an exogenous action, motion would be impossible. And his his theory, as I understand it, is that these reafferent systems, this kind of recursion of action and the knowledge that it was the same organism that produced the action, is the origin of the like a sort of primordial sense of self. But it's interesting in light of what Simondon is talking about here. And, I think you could argue that if Peter Godfrey Smith is right, then, these bodily affordances are sort of built into the idea of self from the beginning.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like some organisms have a very sort of diffuse motor behavior. Like I'm thinking of things like jellyfish or something like that that don't even have a nervous system. So like one part of the organism might respond to contact by withdrawing or some other action, and then the rest of the organism might not have any sort of coordinated response, so that each part of the organism sort of does its own thing, and they have like a loose connection to each other. Whereas in organisms that do have a nervous system, there's some sort of coordination of the responses between different parts of the organism, and this is the sort of holistic nature of the organism that Goldstein was talking about. So in terms of the reafferent structure in the nervous system, so one example of that is in humans, for example, our sort of capacity to guide motor behavior is strongly dependent on these reafferent mechanisms, because nervous signals, signals traveling through the nervous system, are relatively slow. There's a complicated electrical and chemical series of transmission steps, so like to get a signal from part of your brain down your spine and then into your leg, for example, might take a significant fraction of a second, like several hundred milliseconds. But then, like if you're trying to perform some sort of precision behavior, like I don't know, kicking a soccer ball in a particular way, or a football for our international audience, trying to kick the ball in a precise way to hit a target, you have to guide your foot much faster than, like, you can't sort of wait for the signal to travel down to your leg and then detect the position of the leg and then travel back to the brain and then keep repeating that behavior over and over again. Each loop would take so long that the behavior would be over by the time you actually sort of figured out how to respond in the right way. And so what happens is actually that so when you initiate a motor behavior like moving your leg to kick a ball, you at the same time, part of the signal is sort of transmitted to other parts of the brain that track the predicted motion of the limb or of the part of the body, and sort of use that as a model of where the limb is, and so it's much faster because it doesn't have to travel all the way down to the leg. It's just within the brain that the sort of simulation is happening, and then this signal is used to guide the behavior of the limb in future steps of the motion. So yeah, this reafferent signaling, or this reafferent structure in the nervous system, is essential to being able to guide motion at high speeds, because otherwise you would have to like perform one step, then wait to see where your leg ends up, and then perform the next step, and so on, and your motion would be very slow, and it would be very difficult to guide fast motion with high precision.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that reminds me of what he says about octopuses in that book, I think, as we've talked about earlier in discussing this book. But the nervous system in the arms of the octopus is much more complex and recursive than the nervous system in like human limbs. And he says that it may be like, an octopus sort of reaching for something. There may be some kind of top-down, there's a top-down kind of command to move the limb, but then he said it may be sort of like just seeing what happens from the perspective of the central brain, because there's almost like a local information center in each arm due to these reafferent recursive nervous systems.
I mean, just reading this section, there seems to be we're talking largely in terms of science, I would say, and scientific theories about movement, bodily movement. But I think there is underlying this, there's also quite a strong philosophical element as well at play, I would say. So, for example, the whole idea of body schema, I would imagine, relates to Kant. So the notion of the schema, the connection between the concept and the image. So we have an idea of something that we might be able to do, and the derived from the image, or it's brought to the schema brings these two together. And also reminded of the quote from Spinoza, who says, we don't know what a body can do. So there is a really important idea of body within Spinoza's philosophy. And in a sense, this seems to be saying we do know, or we imagine we know what a body can do, whereas one of Spinoza's principles that we don't know what a body can do. And then finally at the end, when he talks about the modality of motor images, so we have this kind of body image or body schema, and is possible. So I would kind of relate that to philosophical concept of the possible, real, etc., as a mode of the motor image is the possible.
Yeah, that's interesting. Spinoza. That's one of my favorite lines from Spinoza. We don't know what a body can do. And that's a sort of famous line, so it's not that's not too original for me to like that line. But I think so. The idea in Spinoza, when he says we don't know what a body can do, is he wants to. So in that passage, it comes up in the passage where he's criticizing the idea that we need to sort of suppose that certain motions of the human body or certain actions that humans perform can only be brought about by an immaterial soul. So he instead holds that there's a sort of parallelism between the body and the mind. That there's always this sort of motion of the body accompanied by some sort of change of ideas, but they don't interact with each other in a causal manner. So we don't need to suppose that the mind has to bring about motion in the body, and so this idea so not knowing what the body can do is for Spinoza has to do with so we're ignorant scientifically of what human bodies are capable of doing, and we shouldn't sort of make that ignorance into an object, into an idea of the immaterial soul that would sort of guide the body or make the body perform certain actions. And I think that same idea is at least compatible with what Simondon is arguing here in terms of the body schema as something possible. So we know what the body can do in the sense that we experience our body as capable of performing certain actions. But we don't necessarily have and this is a sort of internal knowledge. We know it in the first person sense. We experience ourselves as capable of doing certain things, of reaching and grasping and walking and so on. But we don't have a scientific explanation, or the body schema itself is not a scientific explanation for how it is that the human body has that capacity, and that's the aspect that Spinoza is emphasizing. Not knowing what the body can do in the sense of not having a scientific theory or sort of an exhaustive account of what are the capacities of a human body is, I think, compatible with knowing what the body can do in the sense of having an experience from the inside of the body as capable of performing certain actions. I think those two ideas are at least compatible with each other. Whatever exactly Simondon would say about the Spinozistic idea of mind-body parallelism.
Isn't the big difference though that as he says at the end, he says his idea is that it's only possible. It's a possible. Motor image its mode is the possible, not the actual, not the real, I should say.
Yeah, that's a good point. So Spinoza famously is skeptical of the whole idea of possibility, and he thinks that it's ultimately sort of contradictory. So everything that happens is necessary, and it's only in relation to our ignorance that we describe certain actions or certain events as possible. So it's only because I don't know the sort of precise details of the movement of my muscles and so on that a coin flip seems to be contingent. It seems to be something that possibly will turn up heads and possibly will turn up tails. But if I had an adequate understanding of all the motions of my muscles and the air resistance and the weight of the coin and all these things, then the event of coming up heads or coming up tails would just be a necessary consequence of the previous motions of my arm and hand. So yeah, for Spinoza, the notion of possibility has to do with ignorance, and it's a sort of purely epistemic concept as opposed to something that has any ontological validity. I think for Simondon here, when he describes the body schema as having the modality of possibility, I think he's at least in this place or like at this point in his argument, he's not drawing any ontological conclusions about whether there is something such as the possible as like an element of reality, or whether it's something that is strictly related to our ignorance and lack of knowledge of a situation. I think he's describing it's a kind of phenomenological argument here. So it's our experience of the body schema, or the body schema as such is something experienced, and we experience it in the mode of possibility. We feel ourselves as being possible, capable of moving, or having the possibility of moving in a certain way. So he's trying to describe this experiential aspect of how we relate to the body, and so whether that aspect of the body as this sort of possible motion or possible behavior, whether that aspect has any sort of ontological validity, whether it's something part of the fundamental structure of reality, or whether it's only related to our ignorance, I think is something that is a separate question that he doesn't deal with at this point in his arguments. But yeah, it's helpful to make that distinction here.
Actually, one thing I would like to add to this discussion is that, like, I would like to bring up the example of Wolf Boy. Like, thinking about the Wolf Boy, like, he didn't know how to use arms before he was found by human beings, as far as I know. So I'd like to connect this one to the previous part of this book. So whether that is imitation or an instinction, but in a way, the level of the stage of the formation of a body schema, I'm just kind of in a way wondering if that is really based on instinct, because for me, the formation of body schema has to do with the milieu, the imitation of what's going on in the milieu, something like that. And another case is a little bit against this kind of ideas that the disappearance of the function of ears. So long time ago, ears, as far as you know, it that moved, but as time goes by, that didn't function at all. And then somebody still moves their ears, but some others don't do that. Whatever.
Yeah, that's interesting. The case of feral children is an interesting one that psychologists have studied in as much detail as some of these cases allow. So these, for people who maybe don't know about these cases, there have been a few cases throughout history of children who were apparently raised by wild animals, like their parents abandoned them or were killed or whatever, and who lived among like wolves or other wild animals. And these are a lot of these cases are hard to validate. Like someone in 1753 or whatever finds a child and says they were raised by wolves, and it's hard to sort of confirm or disprove that 250 or whatever years later. In most cases, if a wolf finds a human infant, it would probably just eat it. But in these particular cases, it seems like at least some of the reported cases of feral children involve. It seems like the wolf or other animal sort of, for whatever reason, responded to the human infant as if it was one of its own children, and sort of raised it as if it were a child. And yeah, so these children grow up in animal societies in a wolf pack or whatever, and then are found by humans, and often they have a very hard time adapting to human society. They might like eat raw meat or walk on all fours, and make noises more typical of a wolf than a human, and they generally are not capable of learning human language in like the full sense of the term. So yeah, these cases have been studied in a lot of detail, but there's a lot of controversy over like how to interpret them. What exactly they tell us about human psychology or things like that. I think so it's an interesting case where the human body schema obviously becomes very different in a child that learns to walk on all fours as opposed to walking on two legs. It probably depends on when exactly the child was isolated from human beings and human society and things like that. But it would be interesting to look at some of those cases in detail and try to figure out to what extent were they learning from the other animals where they, the society of animals that they grew up in, and to what extent they were sort of adapting innate behaviors and things like that. So yeah, it's a very complicated and controversial kind of case. The case of the question about the ears is I think that one is maybe a bit simpler, because it's a sort of traditional, or it's a typical kind of evolutionary response to a situation where a certain function has no more adaptive value in a given environment. So like a typical case is animals that live in caves or live underground will often lose the use of their eyes over evolutionary time, over many thousands of years. So like moles, for example, they're not fully blind, I don't think, but they have very limited vision because they spend most of their lives underground. So there's no point. So evolutionarily, there's no point in sort of investing the energy required to build an eye if you're just going to spend your whole life underground in the dark and not have any use for that eye in the first place. So with humans, for whatever reason, at some point in our evolutionary history, the ability to move our ears to detect sound became less relevant or less useful, and so this, just sort of taking a guess here, it could have to do with bipedal locomotion. So it's just as easy for us to swivel our heads to locate the source of a sound as it is to compared to other animals that have a more limited range of motion for of their heads, and for them, moving their ears might be more useful. So for us, because we have a bipedal stature or stance, we can swivel our heads horizontally very easily, and then moving our ears might not be as useful anymore, or might not be needed anymore to locate the source of a sound. So that's a sort of evolutionary explanation of why certain behaviors might disappear over time. And then, so it would just be like the body schema of a human being, or most humans, doesn't involve this sort of experience or this feeling of being able to move your ears. Some people have a sort of vestigial capacity to move their ears, but it's not like a sort of key piece of our behavioral repertoire in the way it is for dogs or deer or something like that. So yeah, the body schema develops over evolutionary time in relation to the change in the environment and the mode of life of the organism as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think, let's read one more. Let's read up to the section break, up to the heading for section B. We'll do one more, and then we can call it a day there. So if I can get a volunteer to read up to that section break.
If nobody volunteers, I can read.
Yeah, go ahead.
Indeed, a concrete image of movement always implies, to some extent, a reference to the subject's body schema. To have a concrete intuition of an object's movement means, to some extent, putting oneself in its place and situation, as if our body were very object. For instance, to imagine a plane taking off through motor intuition. Intuition means developing in oneself the progressive application of forces to the takeoff ever faster, with the feeling that one is expanding one's energy without reserve, risking it all, without hesitation or slow down, without turning back or any possible deviation, because at the end of the runway one must, a sheer force of speed, fly up and over the obstacles at which one is flinging oneself. This motor image develops itself with a relatively strong analogical precision because it is of the same order as running fast to jump over an obstacle such a hedge or a brook. It does correspond to the use of human motor possibilities. Conversely, it is much harder to imagine a plane landing because the slowing down during the approach to the landing strip at a specific angle does not correspond to any use of the human body schema. The body schema acts as a selector in the imaginative anticipation of different movements. The movements that can be imagined are those that correspond to a possible implementation of the human body schema as an exhaustive and organized abstract of motor intuitions. It's likely that culture pressures limit the use of motor images as means of intuiting reality in human adults. Moreover, the complete development of behaviors integrates motor spontaneities into organized sequences, which reduces the availability for play, though it is noteworthy that the motor use of the body schema is widespread among children for miming moving objects. A child playing it is not merely a driver or a rider, but also simultaneously car and a horse. The body schema is extended to the internal animation of those objects of use, most immediately connected to the behavior. Motor intuition, in the guise of behavior anticipation, practices an implicit animism. Later, the categories of perception will progressively overlay those of the motor image. Gesticulation as a mode of expression will recede in favor of the use of speech and writing. But a study of the origin of the modes of verbal expression would very likely need to restore the primitive conditions of the semantics of gesture, which implies the projection of images of movement onto reality according to the logic of the human body schema and the activity sequences of which it is the principle. To summarize, the primordial source of the a priori appears to be in the form of anticipations of movement, the organism. Such anticipations take the form of projection of motor images into the milieu coming from this unique and the primary source, that is the organism with its motor schemas radiating out of the body schema. Yeah, I should finish here, right?
Yeah, that's good. Thanks. So he just sort of finishes up this subsection talking about how the body schema relates to motor images. So the example of the plane, I think, is a good one because we can sort of picture ourselves, and children like to play as if they were a plane taking off, right? You sort of hold out your arms as if they were wings, and you run, and then you jump over a stream or whatever. And it's as if you were in the position of a plane taking off. But then the other side, like the plane landing, is kind of hard to picture. Of like, we don't have a sort of corresponding experience of sort of descending at an angle and slowing down and until we land or something like that. Like, we don't have a similar type of motor capacity as the plane landing does. So this is harder for us to imagine, and I think the sort of general idea here is that when we sort of think, or when we, our sort of most basic way of representing an object is to sort of picture ourselves as being that object and having the motor capacities of that object. So our sort of most basic understanding of a car is picturing ourselves as if we were the car, or like what would it be like to move the way that a car does. And he talks about so children in play sort of spontaneously adopt this kind of behavior where you don't just pretend to be a driver, but you pretend to be a car driving around. But then as we get older, we tend to use a more I guess objective form of representation of objects, where we instead of sort of picturing ourselves as being the object, we depict the object as something separate from ourselves. And so the child might no longer play as being a car, but as using a car to drive around. And so this is part of our, and he thinks this is, or the way Simondon depicts it here is that this is a sort of cultural overlay over the more basic biological relation to the object through this imaginary identification. So it's only because our social or cultural sort of customs or usages require that children abandon this kind of imaginary identification as they grow older. It's only because of that we sort of move towards this form of this objective form of relating to parts of the world as entities distinct from ourselves, as opposed to imagining ourselves as being that object.
I think this fits really well with the use of Hjelmsleb's purport and form distinction in 1,000 Plateaus. And maybe we could see this when he talks about how the complete development of behaviors, organizing the sequences of motor spontaneities. This could be seen as the gradual differentiation of a relatively more metastable and de-differentiated sort of potential to organize in different ways. And so, like you mentioned, as the child gets older, it wouldn't occur to them to play as the horse or the car. But when they're younger, the capacities they're closer to purport than to form, and the capacities are relatively de-differentiated. And so there's a sort of broader range of, I guess, becomings available. And I think this even relates to what we were talking about earlier with sort of the notions of what the body can do, being, relatively constrained by these behavioral developments.
Yeah, I think that's. I think it makes sense to see the development of behavior through time, through the lifespan of a human being, for example, as a kind of there's a selection out of possible behaviors that only certain behaviors will end up being incorporated into the behavioral repertoire of the adult human. So, children often will play by, rolling around on the ground and walking on all fours and things like that adults don't really do anymore, except when they're playing with children. There's all kinds of sort of behavioral, there's all kinds of behaviors that children perform that they give up on or stop doing as they grow older. And, to what extent this is part of just sort of biological maturation, and to what extent it has to do with being taught or explicitly told not to perform certain kinds of behaviors, that would be a sort of complicated question to differentiate. But I think we can see the development of human behavior as there's on the one hand there's an expansion of the capacity for action as you grow older. You're capable of at a certain age you learn how to tie your shoes. But before, under a certain age, your motor skills are not precise enough to be able to tie your shoes, and then at a certain age you gain that capacity to tie your shoes. So you expand your motor capacities as you grow older, but then you also sort of lose certain capacities, or at least you exclude certain capacities for motor behavior as you grow older as well. So there's a sort of both things happening at the same time. There's a expansion of motor capacities and a selection out of the sort of whole range of possible motor activities of a human body of a particular subset of those capacities to of which we will sort of take to be our behavioral repertoire.
Can I understand like a human being's like body image or body schema? Like for example, like human being want to fly, but we don't have wings, and then that leads to the invention of the flight, something like that, airplane.
Yeah, I think so. He mentioned in an early, I think in the introduction, he mentioned how humans have this. There's like a longstanding image of human flight. There are like ancient myths about it. There's the story of Icarus and Daedalus, yeah. So there's this longstanding image of human flight, and he relates this to dreams as maybe a source of. Lots of people have dreams of flying, and this could be a source potentially for this desire to fly. And then he also connects it with observing birds and sort of picturing ourselves in the situation of a bird, and what would it be like to fly like a bird. Yeah, so we'll get to later on in the book or in this set of lectures. We'll get to the phase of invention. So there's a whole sort of cycle of the image from this sort of vague anticipation of, flying would be pretty cool, to, progressively coming to a point where you can actually build a device that will enable you to fly. And he points out, I think in the introduction here, that an airplane doesn't really resemble a bird in terms of like the mechanism of flight. Like we don't have flapping wings on our airplanes, and our sort of understanding of like a lot of the sort of early experiments with flight had to do. They tried to copy wings in the sense that they tried to have flapping, some sort of flapping mechanism, and those were not effective. And it was only much later when the physics of like fluids operating in, or aerodynamics of fluids and so on, all of that sort of came together to bring about the capacity to build a machine that would allow us to fly, but it doesn't resemble a bird. So it's a much more sort of abstract connection between this desire to fly and this sort of representation of what it would be like to fly, this motor image of flight. It has to go through this sort of long detour of physical theory before it can actually be realized in an airplane.
Right. Thank you.
Right. So I think we can end here for today. I think it's a good stopping point. So we'll pick up from here next time from the section B. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming out. And I mentioned, for those who maybe weren't here when I talked about this, so I mentioned in the forum on here that I'm going to be traveling in April. And so if anyone has ideas about whether they would like to continue without me or take a break while I'm away, you can put them in that section on there. And yeah, just let us know what you think about that whole idea, what to do during that time when I'm away. Okay, so thanks everyone, and see you next week.